Today, we bring you the story of a poor beggar whose life was nothing but struggle and survival. His real name was Kachi, but the people on the streets called him Kofi. Every single day he sat on the roadside with his broken violin, playing melodies filled with pain, hope, and silent dreams. One day, fate brought him face to face with Billionaire. His true name was Tun, but people knew him as Adwale. What happened next will leave you speechless. Before we begin this journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss such inspiring stories. The sun in Lagos does not rise gently. It climbs, fiery and unrelenting, over the bustling streets, baking the rusted zinc rooftops and pressing its weight on the restless bodies moving through the city. The horns of Danfo buses, the cries of hawkers selling groundnuts, pure water and puff-puff, and the never-ending rumble of engines created a rhythm of survival, the daily orchestra of a city that refused to rest. In the middle of that chaos, at one of the busiest traffic lights in Surulere, stood a boy no older than 12. His name was Kachi, but no one asked and no one cared. To the world, he was just another street child barefoot, with torn shorts and a faded shirt that had lost all color after years of dust and sun. His hair was tangled, his skin toughened by the street. But in his hands, he carried something strange, an old violin with a broken string and scratches deep enough to tell their own story. Nobody knew where he got it from. Some said he found it in the trash behind a music shop. Others whispered that it belonged to a white missionary who once taught in the city before dying suddenly. But for Kachi, the violin was the only thing in his life that gave him meaning. He played it not for coins alone, but because in its sound he found an escape from the cruelty of hunger and the sting of loneliness. Every evening when traffic piled up at the red lights, Kachi would step into space between the rows of cars, raise the bow, and begin to play. It was not polished music, not the kind you heard in air-conditioned concert halls, but something raw, trembling, alive. His fingers knew no formal scales, yet they danced on the strings with the instinct of a bird knowing how to fly. The melodies that came from his violin carried sorrow and beauty together, like the cry of a mother rocking a hungry child or the laughter of children playing the rain with empty stomachs. Some drivers rolled up their windows, irritated at the noise. Some tossed a few naira without looking at him. Others simply ignored his existence. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would pause, lower their window, and really listen. And in those moments, Kachi felt as if the world saw him, not as a beggar, but as something more. Life had not been kind to Kachi. His father had died before he turned 6, working as a mason at a construction site, where an unsteady scaffold collapsed and crushed him. His mother, once a market woman selling yam and cassava, fell sick with a cough that never left. She grew weaker each day, unable to work, and finally one evening she lay down and never woke up. With no family willing to take him in, Kachi wandered the streets, begging for food, sleeping under bridges, and running errands for traders in exchange for scraps. Many times he had been beaten by older street boys who ruled corners like kings. Many times he had gone to sleep with nothing in his belly but the bitter taste of gutter water. Yet through all of it, the violin stayed with him. When he held it, the city's noise faded. The hunger felt lighter. The violin became his second voice, one that told a story he could not explain with words. One humid evening, as the sky burned orange and traffic snarled deeper than usual, Kachi played his violin with more force than ever before. He did not know why. Maybe it was because he had not eaten since the morning. Maybe it was because he had dreamt of his mother the previous night, calling his name with that soft smile she used to wear. The bow moved furiously, the strings wept and soared, and people began to look. Even the impatient taxi drivers leaned forward, listening to the strange, haunting song of a boy who looked like he had nothing yet played, as if he carried the soul of 1,000 ancestors. A woman in the back seat of a black SUV wiped her eyes, whispering, "God bless this child." And then the light turned green, cars surged forward, and Kachi was left standing in the exhaust smoke, clutching his violin to his chest like a lifeline. That night, he curled beneath the half-broken umbrella of a roadside suya seller who had closed shop. His stomach growled, but he pressed the violin against his cheek and closed his eyes, dreaming of a stage he had never seen, of applause he had never heard. Dreams were the only riches he owned, and though they could not fill his belly, they kept his heart alive. But fate has a way of weaving miracles in places nobody expects. One Friday afternoon, when the traffic light once again trapped a long row of cars, Kachi stepped forward to play. This time, as his bow slid across the strings, a sleek black Mercedes stopped at the front of the line. Inside sat a man dressed in an expensive navy suit, his wrist heavy with a gold watch, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. This was Chief Tun Baligan, one of the wealthiest men in the city, a music producer known for discovering talents and building stars out of nobodies. His label had launched Afrobeat singers and rappers into international fame, and his voice carried power in every music hall across Nigeria. Yet, in that moment, he was not thinking of business. He was simply waiting for the red light to change, until he heard Kachi. At first, he thought it was a recording playing from one of the street vendors. The melody was too strange, too moving, too perfect in its imperfections. But when he rolled down his tinted window, his eyes fell on the boy, barefoot and ragged, clutching a violin that looked like it belonged in the trash. And still, the boy's music wrapped around the air like fireflies, impossible to ignore. Chief Tun leaned forward, his heart thudding with something he hadn't felt in years, surprise. The cars behind began to honk as the light turned green, but he did not move. He kept staring at the boy until finally he signaled to his driver. The car door opened, and Chief Tun stepped out into the middle of the road, ignoring the angry horns, the shouts of impatient drivers. He walked straight toward the boy. Kachi froze. No one had ever left their car for him. His bow trembled, and for a second he thought the man might beat him or chase him away. But instead, Chief Tun asked in a calm, commanding voice, "Boy, where'd you learn to play like this?" Kachi could not answer. Words failed him, his throat tight. He just held the violin closer, as if the question itself was dangerous. The chief studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Come with me," he said, gesturing to his car. The street erupted in whispers, some drivers laughing, some shaking their heads. "Omo, this small boy don catch big man," one Okada rider muttered. Kachi hesitated. He had been warned never to trust strangers, never to get into cars, especially with rich men who could easily use and discard children like him. But something in the chief's tone, something in the way his eyes softened when he looked at the violin, made Kachi believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, this was the chance his music had been waiting for. And so, barefoot and trembling, Kachi took a step toward the black Mercedes. His life was about to change forever, though he could not yet imagine how. The days that followed that first meeting between the billionaire producer, Mr. Adwale, and the street violinist Kofi unfolded like an unpredictable storm. Kofi could hardly believe that a man of such status, dressed in silk suits and stepping out of glossy cars, would stop in the middle of Lagos traffic just to hear him play a broken violin. For years, Kofi's life had been nothing but rejection. Shopkeepers shouting at him to move away from their doorsteps, passengers rolling up their windows at the sight of his outstretched hand, and even policemen chased him away like a nuisance to be cleared from the road. But in that brief encounter, something shifted. Adwale had seen not just a beggar, but a soul holding on to music like it was the only piece of dignity left in his life. That night, under the bridge where he usually slept with other homeless children, Kofi could not sleep. His mother's faint voice echoed in his mind, the mother he had lost years ago, who had once told him, "Music can carry your pain farther than your feet ever could." For the first time since her death, those words felt alive, like she had whispered them to prepare him for this very moment. The next morning, Kofi returned to the same junction, violin clutched tightly, as if letting go would mean losing hope forever. His friends on the street teased him, saying, "That rich man is never coming back." He just wanted to feel good about himself. Kofi forced a smile, but in his heart he clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world had decided to notice him. Hours passed. The sun burned, horns blared, and the smell of exhaust filled his lungs, but still he played. Not for coins, not for pity, but because he wanted to believe that the sound of his strings could pull someone back to him. Then, like a scene from a dream, the black Range Rover appeared again, easing into the crowded road. This time, the tinted window rolled down slowly, and Mr. Adewale's face emerged. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he listened, And Kofi, though nervous, played as if the whole world was listening, his fingers trembling but his heart steady, pouring out every hunger, every cold night, every forgotten tear into the bow and strings. When he finished, there was silence so heavy that it drowned out the entire chaos of the street. Adwale finally stepped out, not caring about the curious stares of hawkers and drivers, and simply said, "Come with me." Kofi froze. His instinct screamed caution. How many times had promises been made to him only to vanish into thin air? But Adewale's tone had no arrogance, no pity, just conviction. Still, Kofi hesitated. "Sir, I cannot leave my people here," he whispered, gesturing to the other street children who had grown to be his family. Adewale's eyes softened. "You will not lose them, son, but you cannot help them if you do not first step into your own destiny." Those words landed like thunder in Kofi's heart. Before he could overthink, his legs moved on their own, following Adwale into the car. For the first time in his life, Kofi sat on leather seats, inhaled air-conditioned breeze, and looked out at the city not as a beggar, but as someone on the edge of transformation. His violin rested on his lap like a trusted friend, and he whispered silently to it. "We are going somewhere." The drive to Adewale's estate was another world. Mansions lined the road, with high gates and manicured lawns that looked like they belonged in magazines, not reality. Kofi's stomach knotted with fear. He was a boy of dust and hunger, his shirt torn, his sandals barely holding together. Would he really belong here? When the car stopped at Adewale's mansion, the servants looked startled at the sight of this ragged child stepping out beside their master. One whispered, "Why has Ogre brought a street boy here?" But Adewale silenced them with a glance and instructed, "Prepare a bath, bring him clean clothes, and find the chef. I want him to eat until he forgets hunger." Kofi could hardly move as they ushered him inside. He wanted to cry, to run, to pinch himself awake, but he held his violin close, reminding himself that this was not charity. He was here because of his music. Over the next few days, Adewale introduced Kofi to a new life, but it was not without tests. On the first night, Kofi was brought into a room with polished floors and a grand piano in the center. Adewale sat at the piano, his fingers moving gracefully across the keys. He gestured for Kofi to play along. At first, Kofi fumbled. The violin felt foreign in such a luxurious space. But soon, as Adewale's deep chords filled the air, Kofi's bow danced across the strings with instinct. They created a harmony so raw, so unplanned, that even the servants gathered at the door to listen. Some wept quietly, realizing they were witnessing something rare, a conversation between two souls who had just met, yet understood each other without words. When the final note faded, Adewale smiled for the first time that evening. "You have a gift, Kofi, not just of talent, but of truth. Music like yours can heal nations." But along with kindness came struggle. Kofi was placed in the academy that Adewale owned, a place filled with children from the richest families, wearing tailored uniforms and speaking fluent English. Kofi, with his broken shoes and awkward silence, became their target. They mocked his accent, laughed at his rough hands, and sneered when he spoke of sleeping under bridges. For days, Kofi endured it, returned to his room at night to cry silently into his pillow. He wondered if he truly belonged here, if maybe Adewale had made a mistake. But then he remembered his mother's words, and Jessica, the young girl from the traffic stop, who had once dropped a coin in his cup and whispered, "Never stop playing." That memory was enough to keep him going. Slowly, he began to rise, not by fighting his bullies, but by letting his violin speak louder than their insults. Every time he played in class, even his enemies fell silent. His sound carried something none of them could fake, the depth of survival. The turning point came during the academy's mid-year recital. Parents, dignitaries, and even foreign ambassadors filled the grand hall. Students performed polished routines, but when it was Kofi's turn, the hall held its breath. Standing alone with his broken, patched-up violin, he began to play. The first note was shaky, but soon the room was flooded with melodies that painted pictures of hunger, resilience, and hope. People wept openly. By the time he finished, the applause thundered like a storm, echoing off the walls, refusing to stop. In the crowd, Adewale stood tall, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time, the world was seeing what it seen in a traffic-jammed street. A boy who could turn pain into beauty. That night, Kofi did not sleep. He sat by the window of his new room, looking at the stars, and whispered a promise. I will never forget where I came from. My music will not just be for me. It will be for every child still hungry, still rejected, still waiting to be seen. He did not yet know how far that promise would carry him, but he knew his life had crossed a line between survival and destiny. The city of Lagos had never seemed so alive to Adwale before. The neon lights that reflected in the puddles after rain, the roar of danfos weaving through traffic, the chatter of women selling boli on the roadside, all of it now blended with new rhythm inside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was being noticed, valued, and trained. Every morning, he woke up in a soft bed inside the guest quarters of Chief Balogun's vast estate, a mansion so large that it felt like a village of its own. At first, the marble floors and chandeliers frightened him. He felt like an intruder, a street boy trespassing into a world meant for princes and kings. But the moment he held the polished violin they had bought him, with its shining wood and perfect strings, something inside him began to heal. He realized he was no longer playing to beg for bread. He was playing because the music inside him was finally being allowed to breathe. Yet with this gift came an unspoken burden. Adwale was terrified that he would fail. Chief Balogun had seen something in him, something rare and priceless. But what if it had all been an accident? What if the beauty of his music was only born out of hunger and desperation of the street, and now that he was fed and clothed, the fire would vanish? These thoughts haunted him at night as he lay awake in his new room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning silently above. He would clutch the violin and press it to his chest, whispering to himself, "Don't leave me, music. You are all I have ever had." Chief Balogun, though a man of immense wealth and influence, understood this fear more than Adwale could have guessed. He had built his empire in the cutthroat world of music production, and he knew that raw talent was fragile. It could be crushed by doubt or destroyed by pressure. So, he did not overwhelm Adwale with immediate grand stages or cameras. Instead, he assigned him a mentor, Madame Ifeoma, a retired violinist from a national orchestra who had once been the pride of Africa in her youth. She was a stern woman with streaks of silver in her hair and eyes that seemed to see through the soul. When she first heard Adwale play, her lips pressed into a thin line, not of disappointment, but of recognition. "You are untamed," she told him, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Your music bleeds with pain, but pain alone will not sustain you. You must learn discipline. You must learn to make the violin obey you, not just cry with you." The lessons were brutal. For hours each day, Madame Ifeoma drilled him on scales, posture, bow control, and breathing. Adewale's fingers blistered, his back ached, and sometimes tears rolled down his cheeks when he thought he couldn't bear any more. On the street, music had been his escape, but here it was becoming labor. And yet, somewhere in the middle of this struggle, he began to understand what she meant. His sound grew clearer, stronger, more refined. He was no longer just playing to release sorrow. He was shaping that sorrow into something beautiful, something powerful enough to command silence from any crowd. But not everyone in Chief Balogun's world welcomed the boy. Rumors began to spread in the industry. Critics whispered that the billionaire had gone mad, wasting his time on a street beggar instead of nurturing established talents. Some of Balogun's business partners even laughed openly, suggesting that it was nothing more than a publicity stunt. "You want to make a rat into a lion?" One sneered during a dinner meeting. Adwale overheard fragments of these conversations, and they cut him deeply. The shame of his past returned like a shadow, whispering that no matter how polished his bow strokes became, he would always be the boy who once begged at traffic lights with a broken violin. One evening, consumed by doubt, Adwale ran away. He slipped out of the mansion with his violin tucked under his arm and wandered back to the familiar streets of Oshodi. The air was thick with exhaust fumes. The cries of hawkers filled the night, and the old corners where he used to sleep seemed to call him back. Sitting on the same broken pavement where he had once counted coins, he closed his eyes and began to play. The music that poured out was different this time. It was not the raw cry of survival, nor the disciplined notes of Madame Ifeoma's training. It was both, a balance. People stopped. Hawkers, bus conductors, and passers-by formed a circle around him. Even the impatient Danfo drivers paused, listening in awe. In that moment, Adwale realized something. His gift was not about where he came from or where he was now. It was about what lived inside him, and that no one could take away. When Chief Balogun found him hours later, he did not scold him. He simply watched from a distance as the crowd clapped, tossed Naira notes at the boy's feet, and begged for more. Then, walking up, he placed a hand on Adwale's shoulder and said, "Do you see now? Your music belongs to the world, Adwale. But the world cannot hear you if you keep hiding on these streets. Come with me, and I will make sure your sound never dies." From that night on, something changed in Adwale. He returned to his training with renewed fire, pushing himself harder than ever. Madame Ifioma noticed a transformation. His notes carried not just pain, but also pride and purpose. The street boy who once begged for scraps was slowly becoming a performer whose sound could silence chaos itself. And yet, deep inside, Adwale still carried a promise he had made to himself. No matter how high he rose, he would never forget the children still begging on those same streets, with broken instruments and broken dreams. By the end of that year, Madame Ifioma announced that Adwale was ready for his first test. Not the global stage, not yet, but something close, intimate, and terrifying. A private performance before Lagos's most influential musicians and cultural leaders at Chief Balogun's annual gala. It would be the first time Adwale would stand before the powerful, not as a beggar to be pitied, but as an artist to be respected. As the day approached, fear returned like an old ghost. But this time, Adwale welcomed it. Fear, after all, was part of his music. He would not run from it. He would play through it. And so, the stage was being set, not just for a performance, but for the beginning of a revolution in how talent was seen in Africa. Because Adwale was not merely a violinist anymore. He was becoming a symbol of what happens when the streets and the elite collide to the power of art. The first time A.O. stepped into the Grand Lagos Music Academy, he felt as though he had entered another universe altogether. The polished marble floors gleamed under golden lights. Wide staircases curved gracefully upward like they were reaching to the heavens, and the walls were lined with portraits of famous African composers, violinists, and conductors who had long been remembered as legends. For a boy who had spent most of his life on cracked pavements, playing a broken violin on the dust-choked corners of traffic signals, this new world felt both overwhelming and intimidating. His feet hesitated to move forward, as though he feared the polished tiles might reject the dust on his soles. But Mr. Bamidil placed a firm hand on his shoulder and whispered, "A.O., talent is your passport here. You belong as much as anyone else." And yet, belonging was not so simple. When the wealthy academy students saw him for the first time, his worn-out clothes that even charity bins might have refused, his timid gaze, and the scarred violin case he still clutched like life itself, they laughed and sneered. Some whispered cruel jokes about a beggar boy turned prince, while others mocked that no amount of talent could wash away the street dirt that clung to his skin. Their sharp whispers cut deeper than any hunger he had endured, and for a fleeting moment, A.O. felt the urge to run back to the streets where, at least, he knew his place. But every time doubt tightened its grip, he remembered his mother's voice from years ago, soft, fading, but full of hope. "My son, the world may not feed you, but your music will never abandon you." Classes at the academy were rigorous, almost merciless in their expectations. The instructors drilled students on scales, rhythms, and flawless execution, demanding near perfection with every bow stroke. For children born into privilege, whose entire lives had been rehearsal for success, the pressure was heavy but familiar. For A.O., however, every demand was an unfamiliar mountain. He had never read formal sheet music, never been corrected by a trained master, never studied in an air-conditioned room filled with perfectly tuned instruments. His only education had been the chaos of honking horns, shuffling crowds, and the instinct of survival that taught him how to make raw, soulful music out of broken strings. Now he had to unlearn his rawness, polish his instincts, and mold his gift into something that fit the academy's pristine mold. The nights were the hardest. When other students went home to comfortable mansions, A.O. stayed in the small room Mr. Bamidil had arranged for him in the academy's dormitories. Alone with his violin, he practiced until his fingers bled, until tears blurred his vision, until exhaustion knocked him out on the practice chair. Yet in those moments of solitude, away from the cruel whispers, Ao's music soared freer than it ever had. The violin spoke his truth, his sorrow, his hunger, his longing to be seen not as a beggar boy, but as a human being whose soul deserved to shine. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to appear in the wall of rejection around him. One night during an open rehearsal, when a fellow student failed to master a particularly difficult piece, the instructor, frustrated, asked if anyone else could attempt it. Ao hesitantly raised his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. When he played, every note came alive, not because it was technically perfect, but because it carried weight, emotion, and lived experience. The room fell silent, the sneers replaced by stunned awe. Even the instructor, known for his stern demeanor, nodded quietly and said, "That was not just music. That was life speaking." That moment shifted the atmosphere. Slowly, a few students approached him, some with genuine curiosity, others with reluctant respect. Though prejudice lingered, a seed of acceptance had been planted, watered not by his background but by the undeniable truth of his gift. Mr. Bamidil, too, began to see the extraordinary potential in Ao, not just as a violinist, but as a storyteller whose bow could make audiences cry, hope, and dream. He arranged for Ao to enter the Academy's regional competition, a prestigious event that often served as a gateway for young talents to be discovered on national and even international stages. When Ao learned of this, fear clashed with hope inside him. A competition meant facing not just students in his academy, but also the wealthiest, most trained prodigies across the region, children who had been groomed since infancy with the finest instruments and private tutors. How could a street boy with a second-hand violin hope to stand among them? Yet deep down a voice whispered, his mother's voice again, that music was not about polished notes, but about the heart beating behind them. The day of the regional competition arrived with all the intensity of a storm. The grand hall was packed with dignitaries, sponsors, music critics, and families dressed in glamorous outfits. Banners with golden lettering hung across the stage, and the air buzzed with anticipation. As Ao waited backstage, his hands trembled uncontrollably, his breath shallow, his stomach knotted. He could hear the polished performances of other contestants, swift fingers flying across strings, rehearsed smiles dazzling the judges, applause erupting after each flawless performance. He glanced at his violin, the same old instrument that shared his hunger, his cold nights, his countless tears. Compared to the gleaming instruments of the other contestants, it looked almost pitiful. For a terrifying moment, shame threatened to consume him. But then he remembered the traffic signal, the day Mr. Bamidil had first heard him, the way the world had paused when his music pierced the chaos of Lagos streets. If he could move strangers in the midst of honking horns and shouting hawkers, why could he not move an audience seated in velvet chairs? With that thought, he tightened his grip, steadied his breath, and stepped onto stage. When Ao began to play, the first few notes carried his nerves. They wavered slightly, trembling like a fragile bird. But then something happened. He closed his eyes and let the memories flood in. His mother humming lullabies in a cramped shanty room, the hunger pangs that once gnawed his belly, the nights when he curled up beside his violin for comfort, the pitying glances of strangers who never stopped to see his humanity. All of it poured into his bow, his fingers, his music. The hall was no longer a hall. It became the street corner where his soul had first learned to sing. By the time he reached the final note, silence blanketed the room. The audience sat frozen, some with tears streaming down their cheeks, as though they had not just witnessed a performance, but had been invited into the beating heart of a boy who refused to be broken. Then, like a wave crashing, applause erupted, thunderous, unending, filled with disbelief and admiration. The judges exchanged glances, whispering to each other, but everyone knew something rare had just happened. A street boy had turned the stage into a cathedral of truth. For Ao, that night was not about winning or losing. It was about finally being heard. When he bowed and walked off stage, his knees weak and his chest heaving, Mr. Bamidil embraced him tightly, whispering, "You have changed tonight, my son. Whether they give you a trophy or not, you've already won." And in that moment, Ao realized that music had given him something no poverty, No ridicule, no rejection could take away dignity. Fame, fortune, and recognition arrived like a sudden rainfall after years of parched drought. But for Kofi, they never wash away the dust of his past. The dust of those Accra traffic signals where he once stood barefoot, his stomach aching with hunger, his violin held like a lifeline. The boy who had once begged for coins now walked onto stages where kings, presidents, and dignitaries applauded him. Yet, every time he lifted his bow to the strings, he still heard the honking of cars, still smelled the roasted groundnuts from the roadside sellers, still felt the sharp stares of strangers who once dismissed him as invisible. He never let go of that memory, because to forget it would mean losing the very fire that had built him. In his heart, he carried not only his story but the story of millions like him, children who stood in the streets with nothing but dreams in their eyes. Fame did not corrupt him. It humbled him, and that humility gave him a power greater than any orchestra could provide. As the years passed, Kofi's name began to echo far beyond Ghana. Invitations poured in from London, New York, Tokyo, Johannesburg, and Lagos. His music became a bridge between worlds. The raw, painful melodies of survival intertwined with the polished sophistication of classical symphonies. Critics called him the violinist of the people, because unlike other prodigies groomed in conservatories, his genius was shaped by struggle, hunger, and the unforgiving streets. He played with orchestras that had never before considered African street music as worthy, blending folk rhythms with European traditions, shocking purists, but moving audiences to tears. His unique style could silence a hall of thousands, making every listener feel as if Kofi was playing only for them. Yet, amidst the glory, he never forgot Amma, his mother, the woman who had once tied pieces of cloth to make him shoes, the woman who had worked odd jobs and gone hungry, so her son could hold on to that broken violin instead of selling for food. Even as he stood on the world's greatest stages, he always reserved the front row for her, whispering silently before every performance, "This is for you, Mama." But the brighter his star shone, the more challenges followed. Fame brought critics who accused him of abandoning his culture for European glory, while others accused him of being too raw, too African, too unrefined for the Western elite. Tabloids twisted his story, portraying him sometimes as a charity case, other times as a manufactured miracle. Jealous musicians whispered that he was merely lucky, that without Mr. Mensah's discovery, he would still be begging on the streets. These voices stung, but Kofi had grown up hardened by harsher words and colder nights. He had learned that true greatness did not come from pleasing everyone. It came from staying true to the story that lived inside him. And so, he poured every insult, every doubt, every wound back into his violin. His concert became less about perfection and more about storytelling. Each note was not only a melody but a memory. Every string carried his childhood pain. Every vibration carried his mother's resilience. Every crescendo carried the dreams of countless children still stuck where he had once been. Still, beneath the applause and the spotlight, Kofi's soul longed for something deeper than recognition. He remembered the little children who used to watch him play at the traffic light, clapping with dirty hands, eyes wide with admiration, before running back into alleys where hunger awaited them. He remembered the blind beggar who used to sit near him, humming along to his music, even when no coins fell into his cup. He remembered Amma whispering, "Never let poverty kill your spirit." And so, one night after a triumphant performance in New York, as he sat in his hotel room overlooking the glittering skyline, he made a decision that would change the course of his life yet again. He would not only play for the world. He would play for the streets that raised him. He would build something lasting, something greater than himself, something that would outlive both his music and his fame. That night, Kofi envisioned the Streetlight Foundation for Music and Dreams, a place where street children could find instruments instead of hunger, where they could trade hopeless nights for hopeful melodies, where they could be seen not as beggars, but as creators of beauty. With the help of Mr. Mensah, who had by then become more than a mentor, a father in every sense, Kofi began to raise funds for the foundation. At first, donors laughed. Street kids? Musicians? Waste of money. But Kofi was relentless. He played charity concerts. He told his story again and again, and slowly, the world began to listen. One by one, doors opened. Within a year, in a dusty corner of Accra, Where Kofi once used to sleep on cardboard, a small music school stood. The walls were painted bright yellow. The floor was cracked but clean, and in the corner stood a shelf full of donated instruments, violins, guitars, drums, even recorders. Children who once begged for bread now held bows and sticks, learning not only music but dignity. When the first recital happened, Kofi sat in the front row as Alma wiped tears from her eyes, and Mr. Mensah clapped louder than anyone. The sound of those children playing together was not polished, not perfect, but it was powerful. To Kofi, it was the sweetest music he had ever heard. As the years rolled by, the foundation grew beyond anyone's imagination. From one small school in Accra, it expanded into several towns across Ghana, then across Africa. Kofi traveled tirelessly, not as a celebrity but as a servant, using his story to ignite hope in villages and slums. He would kneel down to children holding broken instruments and tell them, "I was you once. Don't let go." And when skeptics doubted, he would smile and raise his violin, proving with every note that brilliance could come from the streets as surely as it could from golden palaces. By the time he was in his 30s, Kofi had not only become a global musician, but also a movement, a symbol of resilience. His concerts were no longer just performances. They were revolutions of hope. Yet, even as his legacy solidified, Kofi remained the same humble boy who once begged at the lights. He still walked barefoot, sometimes in memory of where he had come from. He still played his old broken violin in secret, the one with cracks and missing varnish. Because to him, no Stradivarius in the world could replace the soul of that first instrument. He still carried Alma's words in his heart, even after she passed peacefully in her sleep, her last words being, "Play for them, Kofi. Play for them all." And so, every performance he gave afterward began with a silent bow to the heavens. And that is the story of Kofi, the boy from the streets who taught the world that genius can bloom anywhere, even under traffic lights. His life became proof that poverty could not kill talent, that hunger could not silence music, that one violin could carry the voices of millions. But most of all, his story became a call to action, a reminder that within every overlooked child might be the next light for the world. And just as Kofi once stood on the dusty streets, dreaming of a tomorrow, countless children still wait for someone to see them, believe in them, and lift them. Perhaps that someone could be you. So, if Kofi's journey touched your heart, if his music of survival inspired you, then remember to support stories like this, to share them, to spread them, and to stand with the dreamers of the world. And if you believe that every child, no matter how poor, carries a gift worth nurturing, then don't just leave now. Stay with us, join our journey, and help us keep telling these stories. Sparkle subscribe today, and together, let's keep the music alive. Violin,